On the morning of July the 4th, in a highly anticipated ceremony at the White House, President Trump officially signed the Big Beautiful Bill, his flagship piece of legislation, into law. The 1,000-page mega bill, which crams in nearly all of Trump's major campaign pledges, successfully passed through both the House of Representatives and the Senate, despite intense controversy and opposition. While the original version passed by the House in May was already contentious, especially due to its impact on the national debt, the final Senate-amended version has drawn even sharper criticism. Economists warn that it disproportionately benefits the wealthiest Americans, cuts support for the poorest, and places even greater strain on America's already fragile public finances. In this video, we're going to break down what's actually in this new law, why many argue it's even worse than the original, and what it means for America's future. Let's now dive into what's actually inside this massive new law, starting with what many see as its biggest issue: the growing national debt. Even before it was signed, experts were warning that the original version of the bill, passed by the House back in May, would already be incredibly expensive. According to the Nonpartisan Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget, it would have added around $2.4 trillion to America's national debt over the next decade. And that doesn't even include the extra interest the government would have to pay because of that borrowing. A big chunk of this cost comes from extending Trump's 2017 tax cuts, which were supposed to expire soon. These tax cuts mostly benefit higher earners, and keeping them in place adds a heavy burden on public finances. But the final version of the bill, which the Senate passed and Trump just signed, adds even more to the debt. While the exact numbers are still being crunched, early estimates suggest it will increase the national debt by another $800 billion over the next 10 years. That brings the total impact of this law to over $3.2 trillion in new debt. If this happens, the U.S. debt could reach 150% of the country's total economy, making it one of the highest debt levels in the world. Why such a big jump? Because the Senate version made changes to keep some Republicans happy. For example, it canceled planned cuts to spending on things like rural hospitals and farm programs. On top of that, it added more tax breaks, especially around something called the SALT deduction. Now, the SALT deduction is a rule that lets people subtract the amount they pay in state and local taxes from their federal tax bill. Right now, it's capped at $10,000 per household per year. The House version of the bill proposed raising this to $40,000 for households earning under $500,000. That already mostly helps wealthier families. But the Senate went even further, protecting legal loopholes that let some rich people skip the cap entirely. That means they could avoid paying hundreds of thousands in federal taxes. So, in the end, this law gives a lot more to the people at the top. An average tax break of over $6,000 for the richest 20% of Americans. Meanwhile, the poorest 20% will actually lose an average of $560 a year, according to a Yale study. And the government will cover the cost of all this by taking on even more debt. The White House claims that new tariffs, taxes on imported goods, will help cover some of the cost. But most economists say these tariffs could slow down the economy and still leave the government with a 6% budget deficit, much higher than the 3% deficit Trump's economic advisor Scott Bessent had promised. This part of the bill has even sparked a public fight between Trump and Elon Musk, who called the bill financially reckless, and once again hinted at forming a new political party or backing primary challengers against Republicans who supported the bill. To help balance out some of the massive costs caused by tax cuts and rising debt, the newly signed law also includes fresh cuts to welfare spending, with a major focus on Medicaid. For those who may not be familiar, Medicaid is a public health program that helps low-income Americans get access to health care. It's funded jointly by the federal government and individual states. But under this new law, the government plans to tighten eligibility rules, making it harder for people to qualify for the program. That means fewer people will get the healthcare support they rely on. On top of that, there are changes to something called the provider tax. Now, this part might sound a bit technical, but it plays a big role in how states get money from the federal government. Here's how it works. The federal government usually pays for about half of all Medicaid costs. So let's say a hospital charges $100 for a treatment. Normally, the state pays $50 and the federal government pays the other $50. But to bring in more money, many states add a provider tax, which is a tax on hospitals. Let's say the state adds a 10% tax. The hospital now raises its fee from $100 to $110. The state collects $10 as tax. But because the total cost has increased to $110, the federal government is now responsible for paying 50% of that higher amount, which comes out to $55. So the state ends up with more money, even though the actual service hasn't changed. It's a clever workaround, but many experts say it's a bit of a loophole that manipulates the system. And now the new law is going to start closing that loophole. The maximum provider tax rate will gradually be reduced to 3.5%, down from 6% in the earlier version of the bill. This slow phase down will begin in 2028. While this might sound like a technical fix, it will have a big impact, because many states rely on this tactic to fund their Medicaid programs. Provider taxes currently account for about 10% of all federal Medicaid funding, and in some states, like Utah, they make up as much as 35%. So, scaling this back means less money for Medicaid and fewer resources for hospitals and low-income patients. According to the Congressional Budget Office, these changes are expected to leave nearly 12 million more Americans without health insurance by 2035. That's a huge number of people who may no longer be able to afford basic medical care, just to help pay for tax breaks elsewhere in the bill. Another major part of the new law that's drawing attention is its approach to energy policy. And this is where the final version takes a very different direction compared to past efforts. The earlier version of the bill, passed by the House, had already proposed pulling billions of dollars away from the Inflation Reduction Act, a 2022 law passed during Biden's presidency. That law had offered huge subsidies and tax breaks to support clean energy projects like solar, wind, and nuclear power, and it helped kickstart a wave of green investment across the U.S. The idea of cutting back these clean energy programs was already controversial. It upset progressive Democrats focused on climate action, and even some Republican lawmakers whose states were benefiting from new factories and jobs created by IRA-funded projects. But the Senate version of the bill initially went even further. It proposed a new excise tax, basically a penalty, on new renewable energy projects. This would have made it even more expensive for companies to invest in solar or wind farms. However, this tax was removed at the last minute, likely to avoid even bigger backlash. Still, the final version of the law keeps most of the cuts to the Inflation Reduction Act subsidies, which signals a major slowdown in the U.S. clean energy transition. These cuts are already making investors nervous, as many had poured money into green energy with the expectation that government support would last for years. At the same time, the new law favors fossil fuels. It includes new tax breaks for metallurgical coal, a type of coal used in steelmaking, and sends a clear message about where the administration sees the future of energy. In fact, Trump's energy secretary has openly said that coal, natural gas, and nuclear are the cornerstones of America's future energy system. Unsurprisingly, these moves haven't gone down well with the public. Poll after poll shows that the bill is deeply unpopular, especially with independent voters, a key group in U.S. elections. One recent Fox News poll found that only 22% of independents support the new law, while 73% oppose it. But even with this public disapproval, most Republican lawmakers are unlikely to push back. Because of fear of political retaliation, Trump has made it clear that any Republican who opposes his agenda could face a Trump-backed challenger in the next election. That pressure is likely to keep the party in line, even if many voters are unhappy.